Hey everybody. So we're going to look at chapter 11 here, the flowering of the Middle Ages, 1150 to 1215. Um, so in this chapter, we're going to look at education and learning. We're going to look at music and poetry a little bit. Um, talk about the Crusades a little bit briefly, and we shall get started. Chartres Cathedral. What's significant about this? This really shows the power that the significance of religion in this time period. The largest expenditure of the government, other than war, was religious building of the church, the Catholic Church. Uh, these were everywhere. Important. The church was the center of community. The church was. It really displays the religious power in Europe of the Christian church. Usually, the largest structure in any town, in any community, was the local church, cathedral, monastery, whatever it was in their local community, whatever represented the religious structure of the region. Typically, the largest structure and the most money spent on these types of buildings. Some of these would take. I mean, there are churches that sometimes there's examples of churches that took 200 years to build, or that churches normally a normal church took decades. It's been decades building some of them. Yeah, they were huge and impressive and incredibly costly. All right, the new learning and the rise of the university. So we'll start with this: new schools and churches. So since the Carolingian period, schools were connected to monasteries and cathedrals. We talked about that as basically the first educational institutions in Europe was the church. Uh, Churches, monasteries, cathedrals. They trained monks, they trained priests, they trained nuns, and those of the upper classes would send their kids there to be trained as well. So this is really where universities grow out of, is the church institutions in Europe. So by the end of the 11th century, the best schools in Europe were typically like in Paris, Bologna, Rome. These types of places had the best and the most prestigious institutions of learning. Students were almost all male. Okay, students were male. Occasionally, a woman would get trained, but it was only if it was a really unusual situation or she was elite, her family was wealthy. But the schools did not normally welcome women at all. Language of the schools was usually Latin. And this is the time period where Latin is coming out of use. Latin is soon will be considered a dead language, literally only used by a few people in academia and the church, of course. So yeah, Latin is falling off. The use of Latin here is going away. Students usually trained in the seven liberal arts, which consisted of two different groupings: the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, that's three, quadrivium is four. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, there we go, geometry, music theory, and astronomy. So we have basically the three that are more very liberal, more language arts, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the one that are a little more math oriented, a little more hard science, as we'd say today: math, geometry, music theory, and astronomy. And yeah, music theory was put in with the math. There's actually a lot of math in music, really is. Let's see, logic was maybe the most interesting subject, perhaps. Um, the subject that was most desired, perhaps, was the training of logic, which is part of the trivium, because it was thought that it could clarify all issues in society. Everything could really go back to logic. Logic could explain religion. Logic could explain the connections between secular and sacred world, or at least attempt to explain these. Now, after you finish studying the liberal arts, you might then go on to actually, this would be more like, I guess this would be like a sort of like a bachelor's degree. And then you would go on to study the actual master's work, where you would actually get the title of master. That's where the master's degree comes from. They would actually call them masters. You would go on to study medicine or theology or law. Um, things like this. Three figures really typify scholars in the period: Abelard's, Heloise, and Peter Heloise, however you want to say it, and Peter the Chanter. I'll talk about each one of them. So Peter Abelard, he studied in Paris. He began to lecture, attract students of his own. As I sort of said once, I think before in the previous chapter, you usually, as a student, would actually go and search and find a teacher that had proper notoriety or interest. You'd actually go and find the professor you wanted to study with. So status was incredibly important as a professor because if you weren't well known, nobody would come looking for you, and you wouldn't make any money. So he studied in Paris. He attracts students of his own while he was a student. He was so well known as a student that he already had his own students, even before he graduated. Eventually, he becomes a master. He is considered a master. His fame brings them an interesting student, a new student, a female student, Heloise. She's one of the very few learned women at the time we have a record of. And we say it that way because we know pretty much everything in this time period is written by men, and we know many men would simply leave women out of stories. Women simply weren't considered important by many intellectual men, by many upper class men. They were considered inferior. So even if a woman was knowledgeable or learned or even wrote something, we may not even know it, potentially. We also know many women who did have some type of success actually wrote as men. They used men's names. So we have some work that we attribute to men that could have actually been written by women, but we don't know because as a woman they couldn't get published, but or any credit for it, or they wouldn't be taken seriously. Heloise, though, is one we actually do have a record of. Abelard and Heloise actually became lovers. They fell in love, and then Heloise became pregnant, and this, of course, becomes what's the word for it? Controversy is not the right word. This is where I wish I was in class because I know some of you could help me out with that. Anyway, it becomes a big deal. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to fall in love and get married. They get married eventually, secretly get married. He was a priest. Remember what I said, all the teachers were associated with the church. So pretty much all your professors were priests, which were supposed to be abstinent. So they weren't supposed to have wives and kids. They're, married to the church. Wow. Yeah, they tried to save his career by doing it all in secret. Eventually, they were found out. They were discovered. He lost his career. They forcibly castrated him, and he was sent to a monastery. Yeah, talk about, today you do something that's bad or something wrong, or you have an affair or something, you ruin your marriage and you embarrass a lot of people. You don't lose your career, get castrated, and exiled to a monastery for the rest of your life. Things were a little bit different back then. It ruined him, although it actually helped her. It actually made her career. She became well known and she went on to write other things. So she was elevated by it. He literally lost his balls. Terrible, really. This was the penalties for challenging the church. This was the penalties for going against the power of the Catholic Church in Europe, which was, many would say the Catholic Church was more powerful than any of the kings. They had more authority. Peter the Chanter, we'll move on to Peter here. He studied in Reims, which I think that's Germany. Don't quote me on that. I think it's Reims. He became the chanter of Notre Dame of Paris in 1183. A chanter is someone who chants religious scripture, religious words during an actual church service. It's a highly esteemed position. Anyway, he became the chanter of Notre Dame in Paris, which was probably the most prominent church certainly in France, if not the whole of Europe. Notre Dame. Like all masters, he gave lectures. And what is a lecture? Well, this is really what begins universities. A lecture back then is really, it's really similar to what we do today. The professor would stand in front of the class and read or talk about a subject. He would talk about writings or a passage. of writing, and he would discuss it. And then afterwards, there would actually be some discussion and commentary and actual class discussion. So in essence, he would lecture for part of the class on a topic, and then the second part of the class there would be more question and answer about the topic, really exploring it more in detail. Not much different than we do today. He often questioned the logic of the Bible, which is, of course, that's dangerous in the time period. He is particularly interested in exploring social issues regarding religious salvation. He wanted to know whether you could be saved or not if you were not, whether you had to strictly believe in the Bible and the passages of the Bible, like word for word. A literalist, we'll call that, someone who literally believes everything in the Bible occurred exactly as it says. Whether you have to do that or not to have your soul saved, whether salvation would apply to you. If you look at the Bible as some people start to in this time period, some people start to look at the Bible more as a moral guidebook, not as an actual history book. In other words, it didn't necessarily all happen like that, but the morality of it is what's important. How to live your life as a better person. It isn't necessarily that everything in the Bible literally happened. And he starts to question that. Can we really be saved, and can our soul can we go to heaven? Because he didn't question the existence of God or heaven. Can we still be saved if we don't believe everything in the Bible is literal? And referring back to that first trivium, can we use logic? This is one of the reasons logic was so important. Can we use logic and reason to actually figure it out? His followers and he often stayed around Paris and preached around Paris. Now, eventually, groups, we've talked about guilds a little bit. Eventually, these guilds, which are these trade guilds, develop around the teachers. These trade guilds develop in the early 1200s, which is the 13th century. And these guilds were usually each one connected to a particular school or monastery or church or cathedral. And eventually, the term they start using is the idea of university, is the name of the guild. And then eventually, because the guilds start to run the schools, which is a guild of teachers, the university, which is the name of the guild, starts to apply to the actual school. So initially, these schools were run by the teachers. The actual professors were the ones that ran the whole thing. There was no, quote, administration. It was a group of teachers getting together as almost a business partnership. And then bringing in students, individual students who actually come to the school for each of the individual teachers. And it was almost like a business partnership. And then eventually, that becomes known as a university, and then it grows into what is today universities. Universities are regulate issues such as student housing, student discipline, your proficiency, what students are supposed to learn, and what grades were students supposed to get, and testing of students. The masters will be the ones who ran the schools. The masters were in charge. Of course, the masters had certain standards to live up to. Behavior, lectures, what they could teach, what they could not teach. A lot of focus on what you could not teach, considering the authority of the church. And different standards. Because the goal of every student at university was to become a master. That was your goal. The training of teachers was very often focused on training other teachers. That was probably the biggest focus, to become a master yourself of a particular subject. Women, generally, schools were also associated with churches, and since the churches were entirely focused on men, so women were typically not allowed. Women couldn't be priests, and therefore, pretty much all masters were priests. So I think I mentioned before, yeah, if I were teaching in this time period, I would be a priest, which doesn't sound like a lot of fun. Celibacy, not so much. So Peter the Chanter we have here. This is Peter on the right. This is from an illuminated manuscript. It's really pretty. I like it. It's beautiful. The artwork is improving a little bit. We get into this time period. Yeah. Don't really have a lot to say about it other than it's really a good demonstration of who Peter was, and then also the skill and the art that you would see in religious scripture, religious books. All right, we're now moving on to section 2. So governments as institutions, England, unity through common law. All right. By the 12th century, the largest government bureaucracy in Europe is England. This is in large part because England is being ruled from both Europe, France, and England. So we have this combined bureaucracy between France and England, where at one point are the same. They're basically ruled by the same kings, and then other times they're going to war with each other. But France being the largest, probably the most influential power in Europe, and then England right next to it with the largest government in Europe, it makes things very interesting how all this works out and how the association between these two countries, which really become the most dominant powers in Europe over the next couple centuries, are England and France. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, we covered this a little bit previously. This brought him the rich province of Aquitaine. I sort of told you that the reason this all happened was because of at least I think I told you. I'm going to cover it again in case, because I'm teaching another class that is similar to this. Not the same class, but it's similar. So maybe I didn't. Eleanor was married to the King of France, and then the King of France blamed Eleanor for him losing a crusade, which was where the Europeans were attacking Muslims in the Holy Land, trying to retake Jerusalem. And he loses one of the crusades, and he blames his wife for it. So he divorces her. That's his justification. Getting divorced is really tough in Europe in this time period. So he gets a divorce from her. Well, Eleanor then leaves him. Obviously, he divorced her, and she goes and marries Henry II, and she actually owned a territory in France, which is Aquitaine. So she takes her territory in France, takes it from the King of France, and actually gives it to the King of England, gives it to Henry. Not so sure if King in England and France had a plan of that. Anyway, so this really expands this territory. So now we have the northern part of France is actually controlled by England, and now the southern chunk of France is also controlled by England, while the heart of France is still controlled by the French and the French king. So he expands his territory. He was now the king of France, and he was king of like about a third of. He was the king of England and king of about a third of England of France. So the king of England, Henry, and about the king of about a third of France, as a result of his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. I'm wondering if the king of France regrets getting his divorce. He lost part of his country by doing that. Nonetheless, his power was most noticeable in his court system, his court, which is his governmental system in and around him. Certain crimes, for instance, murder, arson, rape, these were often declared violations of royal law or what is known as the king's peace. This became a common term used in Europe. The king's peace is royal authority, things that fall under the authority of the king, which means the king can make all the decisions, even though there is a common law and there is a court system of some sort. So common crimes would be more likely to be tried by the common courts and the common law, but certain crimes were so heinous that the term we use today is probably capital crime: murder, arson, rape. Those are things that are what they call are crimes that are so high that the only person who can actually adjudicate them properly is the king himself. So that's violating the king's peace. And he would then be subject to special punishments, which often resulted in executions, mutilations, lifetime imprisonments, things like that. You didn't want the king to have to try your case because it was probably not going to turn out well for you. There were also these royal judges. These royal judges would also hear other cases, the more of the common law cases. A dispute on inheritance, a dispute on a dowry, a dispute on land, for instance. Common criminal cases, thievery, burglary, something like that, assault or whatever. What this does is it unites all of England under what we call a common law system. This is the first country in Europe that has this. A common law system which should apply to all people. Now, we do know the elite often were able to get out of this. Elite people, even though the common law was supposed to apply to them, they often didn't. That's actually going to change here in a bit with the Magna Carta. But the idea was it was supposed to apply to most people. Well, we do find that the common law doesn't apply to the rich and wealthy. The upper classes, the elite, they can get away with crimes. that common people would literally destroy their lives. They get away with it. A slap on the wrist, a fine, or they simply ignore it. So the common law starts to apply to most people, but it doesn't apply to the elite yet. Henry faces a lot of opposition from the church. The church had its own system of law and justices and courts. And many people in the church believed that if you committed a crime and you were of the church and the clergy was of the church, or you committed a crime associated with the church, land was a big problem with this because the number one owner of land in Europe was the Catholic Church. It owned more land than anybody else. So a lot of times disputes over land or taxes would come up. Well, taxes were often paid to the church. The land, a lot of it is owned by the church. So many times these cases would come up, and in England they said the king and his judges need to actually try the case, and the church would say, "Wait a minute, stop! That's our land. It's our taxes. It's our clergy. They need to be tried by the Catholic judges and the Catholic authority." And the king says, "No, I don't think so. In my country, those types of cases are tried by my common law and judicial system." This created a real rift between the church and England. It really did. It created an issue there. This conflict really, and his archbishop was one of the big problems. This conflict over royal jurisdiction, that's what I just covered, over whether who has jurisdiction over the court cases, whether it is royalty, which is the king in common law, or whether it is the church. Well, a lot of this comes to a head under Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket was I think he was a bishop, wasn't he? Archbishop. Thomas Becket was an archbishop. This becomes probably the greatest battle between church and state in the entire century, the entire 12th century. All right. Becket is killed. He's an archbishop in England, I believe. He is killed when Henry's people, the people who work for King Henry, actually murder him in his cathedral. They kill him in his own church. And these are people who represent the people of the king. Now, the king didn't order it, we don't think. The king ordered it. That seems a stretch, even though some people did blame the king for ordering it. I think it's a stretch, really. I don't think the evidence is really there conclusively. It seems a stretch for a king to order an archbishop being murdered. I mean, that's pretty bad. Nonetheless, some of his men think they're doing the king's work, and they go and murder this archbishop. All right. Of course, public outcry about this, because everyone blames Henry for it. It doesn't matter if Henry actually stuck the dagger in the guy or not. What matters is it was Henry's men, and everyone knew it was Henry's men that did it. Huge outcry over this, and they all blamed Henry for it. They said Henry needed to go and he needed to apologize to the church. He needed to do public penance. He needed to just be shamed for doing such a heinous act, murdering a high officer, a high official of the Catholic Church. He's supposed to make apologies to God and ask the people for forgiveness for doing such a thing, even if he had nothing to do with it. He's the king. It happened in his country. Therefore, ultimately, it falls on him to deal with this. The buck stops with him. Now, Henry exerted power in England through his courts. He has all kinds of power and authority in the court system in Europe, and he doesn't try this case. This case doesn't really get tried by anybody, and he does eventually beg for forgiveness, even though he doesn't at first. He refuses to do it at first. Eventually, he does beg for forgiveness, and it really shows this challenge between who gets to try the courts, who gets to actually try the cases, who has authority over it. And ultimately, even though the king claims he has all authority over such cases that are in his territory, his royal authority, when it really comes down to this high crime, which under his rules would mean it would be part of the king's peace, it's a murder, he has to actually defer to the church because he gets such intense pressure from the people. And this is significant because eventually the people change everything in England. It's just interesting how to do this. Even though he had such power and authority, after all this happens, he loses a lot of status. A lot of people don't trust him anymore. The church doesn't trust him, of course. He does eventually beg for forgiveness, but it's simply too little too late. And further, Now, because France is a Catholic nation and France is very closely tied to the Catholic Church, Henry is now treated as a vassal of the French king after this. In other words, his entire status was knocked down a whole level. He's now actually considered a vassal, a sub king under the French king now, as a result of this whole thing. So, this challenge between church authority, state authority, secular versus sacred, who wins this? The church generally wins this. And France wins this. Even though France really had nothing to do with it, France is a victor in this situation. France actually comes out on top. The church comes out on top. It was tough. Henry faced rebellions from France. He constantly faced wars with France, even his own kids. His own children, when they became adults, they rebelled against him and tried to overthrow him and kill him. Matter of fact, this happens so often in Europe, we actually have a name for it. It's called regicide. It's killing of kings. If we have a name for something, that means it happens a lot. I mean, to actually give it a title, it happens. The killing of royalty, the killing of kings. So between France and his own family, he constantly had to watch and wonder when he was going to be killed and stabbed in the back or poisoned. Challenging. All right, Henry's successors. Richard I, sometimes known as Richard the Lionhearted. I think this was I think Shakespeare made a play about this, King Richard or something. Richard I, he ruled from 89 to 99. He ruled for 10 years. Pretty much was gone the whole time. He actually was gone the whole time of the crusade. He wasn't even in England pretty much as ruling. And then I think his brother was King John, 1199 to 1216. In case you're aware of the Robin Hood stories, this is when Robin Hood occurs under Richard and John. The story of Robin Hood occurs under King Richard and King John. Richard was said as the good king, and John was the bad king, the evil king. Eh, yeah, yeah, it's a story. It's a fictional story. Anyway, monarchy grew rich from fees, royal estates, and taxes. Richard was known as the Lion-Hearted for his boldness. Of course, he was criticized because he was an absent king. That's why I sort of hesitate. He was never there. He was the king of England, but he spent his whole time in his crusades. He even got captured. He was even imprisoned by the Muslims for a while, I guess. I assume it was the Muslims that captured him. He was involved in the Third Crusade. The same year he was crowned king, he takes off for the Holy Lands. He's captured, held for ransom. Eventually, he does return home and dies shortly afterwards. However, I guess what is really a credit to the bureaucracy, which I sort of started this section with, the largest bureaucracy in England or in Europe, the country ran fine. Pretty much the country ran along peacefully and normally his whole time he was gone. That's a real credit to the established bureaucracy and government. I mean, that the whole government just continued ticking along just fine, even though the king was thousands of miles away and totally uncontactable and just gone for years. Didn't seem like it even mattered. Very interesting. John took over. John immediately goes to war with France. He immediately goes to war with Philip. Philip in France as soon as John takes over as king. Philip II. John's army is defeated in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines. And this is where England is actually. This is where actually England rebelled against John. Some of the English lords rebelled against him and actually turned against him, believing he was an unjust king. The real reason for this was the fact that if he had been winning the wars and the kings under John, the other lords in England, had been making money, they would have been fine. They wouldn't have cared. But the problem is John wasn't winning. John was losing against France. And furthermore, he was killing thousands and thousands of English people because they kept having to recruit more soldiers to go fight against, not in England even. They were attacking and fighting in France, across the water. They weren't even really protecting England. They were just trying to sort of take over France. So his lord said, "You're taxing us you're taxing us unfairly. You're killing all of our men, and you're not bringing back any treasure. You're not, if you're bringing back treasure and wealth, we'd probably be okay with it. But you're not doing that, so we want a new king." So they rebel against him and actually cause him to be defeated. 1215, and this is what I mentioned a little bit ago, the very famous document, the Magna Carta. In England, this might be considered the most important document in their entire country. This was so important during World War II. I think it was World War II. England actually secretly transported the Magna Carta to America and I think it was locked away in Fort Knox for the entirety of like World War II, because they were so afraid of what if Germany actually overran and took over England, which would have happened if England was an island. England would have been conquered by the Nazis, the same as everywhere else in Europe. But they simply couldn't get their tanks there. Anyway, so yeah, the Magna Carta is so important in English history that it was the one thing they actually had to transport out of the country and secretly hide over here to keep it protected in the most secure place in the world, I guess, Fort Knox, whatever. Interesting. Anyway, the Magna Carta, known as the Great Charter, it defines all the obligations and rights of the nobility. John was forced to sign this we're not going to say gunpoint. I don't believe there's guns yet. Although soon we're going to have guns and muskets. We might have them already, possibly. Not in wide use, though. So at sword point, if you will. He was forced to sign it at sword point. A couple other things in the Magna Carta which it's so significant. This is really considered a foundation of Western government. Really, it is. The Magna Carta forbade the king from breaking any rules or customs without actually consulting the government. He had to go through the government to actually change any laws. He had to uphold all of the common laws for all free men, and all men were considered free in England. This is the first country in Europe to do this, to declare all men free. Although in practice, it isn't exactly quite that nice. You were still a poor peasant, but at least you weren't a serf, I guess, is the way to put it. And serfdom is really almost slavery, and peasantry is you're simply very, very poor. But I suppose you're technically free. So it really declares that all men are free in England, that all laws have to be obeyed and they can't just be changed willy nilly, that any type of law that wants to be changed has to actually go through a legal system. And then, even above that, this is maybe the most significant thing, perhaps. Well, they're all very significant. All this is really foundation. I mean, this is one of the most important documents in world history for Western civilization. It really establishes the beginnings of some type of representative democracy of some sort. We don't call it that, but this really is sort of the beginnings of it. The king is actually has to obey the law too. Nobody's above the law. No king, no lord, no noble. In essence, under the law, the richest man is equal to the poorest man. Now, we know in practice it doesn't work that way. In America, we know this today. If you're rich and wealthy, if you're powerful, if you're a celebrity, if you're a politician, we know they get away with shit. That you and I would end up in jail and they walk. We know it happens. You know, it helps when you can afford $1 million lawyer. So we know in practice it doesn't for the upper elite. But 99% of the time, this does apply. That everyone is treated fairly under the law, at least generally fairly. We can't ever say that there's no such thing as bias. There is bias. But previous to this, there was no type of equality. It was simply accepted that certain people the law didn't apply to, and everyone else had to obey the law and got punished by the law. The Magna Carta says now everybody has to be equal under the law, and that any laws to be changed have to have approval of government officials. The king can't just do things. This really creates the foundation of modern Western democratic governments. Is really created here. Even though this is not that yet, it's really the start of it. It's an incredibly important document. And our founding fathers, when they wrote the American Constitution, there are passages in the Constitution which refer directly to things from the Magna Carta, talking about equality and common law, and talking about everyone having to be treated the same under the law. There's several things in the Constitution which can be directly related. Because I consider our founding fathers were all English. They're all English or descended from England. I mean, that was the way it was. Very interesting. It's very significant for English history and also for American history. The Magna Carta is. We have hanging thieves here. This is an example of the new common law. Many crimes, as I mentioned before, rape, murder, arson. These were considered crimes against the king and also crimes against all the people. These are capital crimes that are against all people and should not be allowed by anybody. Punishments were severe and immediate. To break the king's peace, one of these capital crimes, as I said a little while ago, it almost always results in severe punishment, lifetime imprisonment, or execution. This kind of stuff. In this particular case, the crime here was simply thievery. What? That's not a capital crime. That's not a king's peace. Normally, it would not be. However, it was thievery from a church, which makes it a capital crime. You are now basically you're stealing from God. That makes it a capital crime, which meant execution. Um, don't mess with the church because you will swing. You will swing for it. Yeah, another illuminated manuscript from a book of some sort. All right, what do we have going on here? Map of Europe from 1150 to 1190. We have the Holy Roman Empire here. Look how huge it is now. It now is the largest governmental institution in Europe, the largest body in Europe, although it is not really unified. There are kings of the Holy Roman Empire, but put it this way: the Holy Roman Empire has often been more compared to a confederation. A confederation is, well, imagine this: imagine the United States, 50 states, and take away the federal government. There is no Washington. It's just 50 states, part of the US, and all the states are working together and having to negotiate with each other. We're all considered part of the same union, but there's no one who's really in charge. There was a king, there was even probably an emperor, probably was called, but the reality was how there were hundreds of different kings and lords and princes, and many of them operated entirely autonomously and really had no association with the other kings and lords. Matter of fact, sometimes they simply fought each other, even though they were all part of the same quote unquote empire, Holy Roman Empire. It was not holy. It wasn't run by the church, even though the church was part of it. The church is part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's probably why we end up calling it that. The church isn't really running it. It's not Roman in any way, shape, or form. It's entirely European feudal society. There's no Romanness to it really, and yet empire is really a stretch. It's really a confederation, but nonetheless, that's what we called it. We called this. It was this loose alliance of a bunch of different kings and lords, and there was someone who was considered to be an emperor. So we have Henry ruling up here in England. We have Henry as vassal of the King of France, which ruled from right here in the orange area. So here we have Normandy all the way down to Aquitaine. So half of France was actually ruled by the King of England under the name of the King of France. So really, all of this was actually ruled by the King of France, technically. Again, it's really confederation. You have different lords down here, you have different kings down here, you have the King of England itself, but between Normandy and Aquitaine and these other areas, you had multiple different lords, which were generally autonomous, even though they might have technically owed allegiance to the King of England, who was technically owed allegiance to the King of France. Where did this really matter? All this feudal and all these different vassal levels, when did it really matter? More than anything, it really mattered when war came. When the King of France called for soldiers, who fought on his side? This territory did, and this territory did. They came calling when the King of France called. So really being a vassal under the King of France meant maybe you have to pay some taxes, maybe. But more than anything, you had to provide soldiers, and you had to fight for the king when he called for war. It's really almost like you're an ally of the King of France. Sort of. It's interesting how it all works. Here we have actually in a church, Eleanor and Henry. They're considered the heroes, really. They're considered very significant. This is made of walnut, limestone. They were buried in a monastery in France. Their bodies are, their bones or dust or whatever be left at this point are in there. Buried in a monastery in France. Truth be told, the evidence indicates they hated each other. They fought with each other as much as they fought with other people in Europe. She was very strong-willed. That's probably why the King of France wanted to divorce her. Yeah, he used the failing at a crusade to blame her for it. Said she was cheating on him. She may or may not, we don't know. But she was probably simply too strong-willed for him. Because it is actually debated who really ruled England. Like, how much power did Eleanor have? She was incredibly powerful and authoritarian. And she might have actually, in some cases, overruled her king husbands. Never was really considered a queen, but from behind the scenes, she might have been the one pulling the strings on both France and England to some degree at different points. All right, let's talk a little more about France. Ironically, the weakness of France really leads to its expansion. What? The weakness of France actually leads to its growth. Talk about that. In 1180, the French crown passes to a 14-year-old boy who becomes the king of France, Philip II. 14-year-old boy becomes the king. Not uncommon. Not uncommon. When Philip comes to the throne, he ascends to the throne. The royal domain, the entire domain of France, really, truthfully, that he had actual absolute authority over was just the Ile-de-France, this little orange area here. That was the only place that Philip really had true authority over. Anything outside the Ile-de-France were technically vassal lords, but many of them were, oh, on paper we're a vassal of the king, but we really don't give a shit about the king. We do our own thing. We don't really care. On paper, yeah, but in reality, nah, we don't care. Well, a lot of that changes. Um, the king, the king of England, pretty much controlled most of the rest of France. We've talked about that. From 1190s to 1214, when Philip actually defeats John, the king of England, which we already spoke about, Philip eventually gains control of all the rest of France, becoming rich and powerful, earning him actually the name of Philip Augustus, implying he's like a Roman emperor. They really love the Roman idea, the Roman whole idea in this time period. 800 years now after the Roman Empire fell, and these people are still thinking they're Roman emperors. Talk about living in a fantasy world, right? Anyway, they named him Philip Augustus. To govern his territories, Philip institutes new forms of government, new forms of administration. He employs royal officials to keep accounts, and he actually starts documenting and filing all government records. We have the first, England really wasn't even doing this yet. The first real government record accounting system is being built. A lot of it didn't survive because a lot of it's been destroyed. France has been plagued by more wars than maybe any other European country, maybe. Constant warfare in France. Or every generation there's something going on. So a lot of the records have probably been burned and destroyed because not many of them survive. But we think at the time there were thousands of documents, thousands of records. He had an entire staff of royal scribes, hundreds of people that spent their entire full-time job just writing down all the records and documents and all this kind of stuff. So big, important accounting system. Most of it is gone, probably been destroyed by the different wars. Hell, the French Revolution, they burned everything. Um, so, like English monarchs, Philip relied on members of the lesser nobility, the lower lords, which would be like educated knights or priests, really for his administrative staff. We see a whole new administrative situation. It is not as extreme and as big as England, but it is much, I say it differently. England is big in its depth. It's got multiple levels, incredibly complicated. France is more big in its breadth. It really covers a huge territory, much larger area, and a much bigger population than England. A lot more records, a lot more documents. Really, and it creates a huge administrative staff, thousands of officials, thousands. It is really a bureaucracy. It is a bureaucracy like in England, just a little bit different, but still, these are two huge government bureaucracies, which are entirely new. Nothing like this has ever existed. The only place we've ever in the world have government bureaucracies like this is in China. That's like it. I can't think of any other place that has massive government bureaucracy like this. India, maybe at some point, but it's new for the Western world. But it is the way it's always going to be moving forward because we know that's the way it is today. I mean, look at Washington today in the United States. There's millions of people in Washington that work for the government. Millions. I think last I remember reading is like 4 million people that work for the United States government. And we're not talking about people in uniform. This isn't military. Military is millions of others. We're talking about just people in suits and ties and working in dresses and working in civilian jobs in Washington. Millions. Um, you know how big bureaucracy is today in the United States? 1 out of every 7 adults work in a government job in the United States. Government bureaucracy is a wave of the future. And it starts really here. We start to really see this. They served as officers of the court. They also oversaw the king's lands. They collected taxes. And these government officials really are a breadth, as I said, not depth, but breadth. They really cover the entirety of the entire realm, both the parts covered by France and England. You have government officials now in every county, every territory, every city, every community. You can find them everywhere. You can feel the influence of the king and the royal government everywhere now. Quite interesting. As Ile-de-France, these are the areas he takes over as Philip Augustus. We see other areas that he acquires, all of this, greatly expanding the power of the French king. Greatly, I mean, look at the size of the Ile-de-France. He adds all of these. He adds all the tan areas, and eventually these two green areas are sort of ally areas. He increases the size of his royal domain about 8 times over. Much bigger, much bigger, much bigger authority, which ultimately increases his influence in Europe greatly. Now that he has a lot more lands, a lot more money, he has a lot more power, he's much more significant in the overall socio-political culture of Europe. Let's look at Germany a little bit here. So 1152, King Frederick I, he ruled from 1152 to 1190. He was called Barbarossa. That was a title. He was elected to power in Germany. In order to maintain their loyalty, Frederick handed out lands and territories to lots of other lords, lots of German princes. He demands in return they acknowledge him as their lord, as their king. This is all. It's basically this loose confederation we're talking about, which becomes the Holy Roman Empire. This is what becomes the Holy Roman Empire. They were still generally autonomous and independent, but they were just simply expected to acknowledge him as king, or eventually emperor. He creates this lord-vassal relationship with all of these lords. He gives them land, he gives them money, he gives them wealth and treasure, and in return they're willing to call him lord, and they're willing to be his vassal. However, they want to still be independent. Again, on paper, yes, you're our boss. But in reality, at home here, we are our own boss, and we don't really care about you hundreds or thousands of miles away. So he wasn't ever really able to get total authority over all these different lords. At one point, there were, good lord, at one point there were over 300 lords in Germany, 300 different princes that all claimed that they were king or lord over their domain. 300. Yeah. Frederick also rules northern Italy as part of that, what we call Holy Roman Empire. A lot of resistance from the Pope. A lot of resistance from Italy. Italy had constantly wanted to have its own dominion. It wanted to rule over itself. The heart of the Catholic Church and the entire papal area, means that entire area of central Italy that was incredibly influenced by the Catholic Church, they wanted to be independent. They wanted to declare themselves independent, and they didn't really want to owe allegiance to any king. Now, Frederick had a very high view of his power. He even really considered himself to be an emperor. He was very much influenced by the revival of Roman law. Again, this is the beginning of the Renaissance, and the Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth implying rebirth of classical knowledge, and that classical knowledge means Roman and Greek. So the Renaissance is the rebirth of classical Roman and Greek knowledge and learning, philosophy and science and all this kind of stuff, art included, art and literature and all that. So he really considered himself sort of a Renaissance man. He really believed he was the proper person who was knowledgeable about Roman law and Roman culture, and he also, on top of this classical belief that he was, in essence, he became so tied up in it, this classical rebirth, this Renaissance learning, and this idea that he respected it, and it was a golden age. Many people in Europe often, that's the reason Renaissance occurs. Many people believe Rome was the golden age of European society. He decides that he's an emperor. He starts calling himself an emperor. He gets sort of delusionally involved in this, believing that he is a sort of a rebirth of Roman emperor. And he actually believes he's sacred and divine. He starts to truly believe he is partly of God. I'm not saying God, but blessed by God. because he's got so much power and influence, he starts to believe that God is actually guiding him, just as God guided the old Roman Empire. Interesting. He does believe he is a universal emperor over all of Europe, over this Holy Roman Empire, and he does change the name of it to the Holy Roman Empire. He's the one who actually gives it this name. It was neither holy because the church didn't sanction any of this. This had really nothing to do with the church. This was purely about secular power. Even though he claimed to be sacred, he claimed to be blessed by God, the church didn't bless him. Not at this point in time. Definitely didn't bless him. Yeah, he was maybe a megalomaniac. Anyway, in 1167, many other cities joined with the Catholic Church, and they actually push him out of Italy. They actually remove his power and authority from all of Italy. So now the Holy Roman Empire doesn't include Rome or the Catholic Church. It's neither holy nor Roman, is often what we'll say. He faced problems in his own Germany. He had his own lords that would try to rebel against him. He can't control Italy, loses Italy, and then Henry the Lion actually rebels against him. So we have the lords and princes in Germany rebelling against him. Many people are threatened by Henry's power. Frederick actually calls Henry too, because it gives the appearance. This is a totally different Henry, by the way, not the one we were talking about with England. This is Henry the Lion, a different Italy, different Henry. There's many people threatened by Henry and believing that, because many people do follow Barbarossa. Most of the empire do consider him lord. So many people are threatened by Henry's uprising. Barbarossa's threatened, believing Henry might actually be trying to overthrow him in some way. So Frederick actually calls Henry to the king, to the court, to the palace in 1179. Henry doesn't show up. Frederick actually charges him with crimes, charges him with violating his duty as a vassal, takes all of his lands from him, and then 1180 actually kicks him out of Germany. So the power of the emperor is still quite large. He still controls most of this German empire. Even if Italy doesn't agree with him, even if Henry didn't agree, he has enough power to take everything from Henry and exile him from the country with nothing. Destroys him. He's able to do this under the legal authority of vassalage. Even though people were willing to challenge Barbarossa and his authority, what they were not ready to challenge was the system of vassal and lord. They were not ready to break that system. And as a vassal, you are required to obey the rules of your lord. And the fact that Henry refused to obey his lord meant he actually broke the laws of vassalage. The entire feudal system could fracture and come apart if vassals stopped obeying their lords. Because if Henry wouldn't obey his lord Barbarossa, what about some other lord? What are they afraid of? What if their vassals stop obeying them? Citing, well, Henry didn't obey Barbarossa and he got away with it. Therefore, maybe we don't want to obey you. Maybe as knights, we don't want to obey you as our prince or our king. So the whole system could tumble. So pretty much everybody got behind Barbarossa and said, well, Henry, you screwed up. You should have shown up as you were told. You should have done what you were told. Because we can't threaten the entire system. It just still shows that he is an emperor in many ways. He is a king and he has a lot of power. But it's limited in some ways. And it wasn't really holy or Roman. Frederick Barbarossa here. You can see what he's holding in his hands there, right? He's dressed as a crusader. This is the time of the Crusades, when the Europeans are attacking the Muslim lands and trying to take back Jerusalem, and we basically have a 200-year war between Muslims and Christians. He's dressed as a crusader with the big cross and the shield back there on his back, the religious thing. And he's portrayed as a defender of Christianity and a persecutor of Muslims. He's holding the Christian symbol in his hand, and if you were to read all the writing around the side, it portrays him as someone who kills and defeats the evil Muslims. And Muslims were portrayed as evil by the Christians in this time period. They were the evil. They were the monsters that had to be destroyed. Quite interesting. All right, now we're going to look at the growth of vernacular high culture and love poetry. Oh, that's sweet. So lyric poetry. That's music. Today, if you ever listen to music and you listen to the lyrics, the words, so lyric poetry is really what becomes music, what we would consider to be music. These are at this time period they are poems that are sung, but with music or musical instruments. They were often written in Occitan. I have Occitan on here, right? Occitan was the vernacular common language in southern France. What is vernacular? Vernacular means common language, spoke by common people. We're not talking about Latin. That's of the elite. That's of the church. But if you're in France, it's typically French. Germany, it's German. Spain, it'd be Spanish. Well, the common language spoken in southern France was known as Occitan. Um, this language is probably inspired by Arabic and Hebrew language, and also Arabic and Hebrew love poetry from Al Andalus. Pardon me, Al Andalus. That's Spain, which in this time period, part of Spain is still controlled by the Muslims. Southern Spain is still Muslim, known as the Kingdom of Al Andalus, or I'm not sure if it's Al Andalus or it's actually also part of the Almoravid Kingdom as well. Anyway, it's Muslim controlled. So we think a lot of this poetry was actually inspired by Muslim and Jewish language and writings. The Austin poetry became a model for troubadours. A troubadour is basically a singing poet. You might be familiar with the term like a bard. You've ever heard of a bard? Someone who goes around to taverns and public places with a musical instrument and they sing in public. They're generally musically singing love poetry or other types of poetry. This became common for troubadours. We also will see female troubadours, these lyric poets, these singers. Um, this is really the basic of modern singing and modern music. It really starts with all of this. Because up to this point in time, the only music that really existed generally was religious music. So this becomes more of a common vernacular music for regular people. They dazzled their audience with these rhymes and these varied meters, which would be varied speed and varied types of music to make it more interesting, faster, slower. Again, I'm not a music person, so don't even ask me about that. But anyway, get an idea what I'm talking about here. You know, fast, slow, the different languages, the different styles. They would switch it up a lot to make it interesting, to make it exciting. Today, think like different genres of music, different types of music to make it interesting. Most of the poetry actually resembled Latin religious poetry. However, it is sung in the vernacular, and they add in a little more spice to it. We see more references to sex or to relationships or to even very bawdy stuff sometimes, even stuff that by their standards back then might have been pornographic, sexual stuff, things like that. And further, they also add a lot of emotion into it. Religious, scriptural music and poetry would not have been very emotional, really, but we see more ideas about love and emotions and passion and again sex. Um, they sometimes talk about the emotional relationship between God and humans. Still, a lot of things reference God here. This is still a time period where most things eventually get back to God. The key to the troubadour verses is what the idea of cortesia, or in translation, courtesy. Courtesy. The refinement of individuals living at court and their struggle to achieve virtue. In other words, the upper classes who would be involved in administration and being lords and aristocrats, and their goal to achieve virtue and enlightenment, to be cultured and educated, and to be respectful. Sort of think like the knight in shining armor idea, where he throws his cape down over a mud puddle so the dainty damsel in distress doesn't have to get dirty. He goes off to slay dragons to save the woman. They go to war to fight for the honor and glory of the kingdom. While when war isn't going on, they sing love poetry and play musical instruments and paint watercolors. I'm not kidding. They really had this ideal to where the perfect ideal man, and this would portray to women a little bit, but really it was more about men, frankly, would be warriors when needed, and then the rest of the time they would be calm, loving, and compassionate artistic people who could paint and sing and write music. just as easily as picking up a sword and cutting a Muslim's head off. This is during the Crusades. That was a focus. When you went to war during this time period, it was more often than not to go kill Muslims. So that was the way it was in this time period. 200-year war, the Crusades, really between Muslims and Christians over the Holy Lands. This ideal was how what often came out in troubadours' love poetry, was this ideal of this perfect virtuous man, or occasionally woman. Really interesting. They would sing about love. They would sing about sexual conquest. They would even talk about women's equality would actually come out of these sometimes. Love could solve all things. Love could calm the savage beast. This kind of stuff. Yeah. One of the most influential roles women had in society outside the home. Of course, at home, they're very influential, taking care of the home, raising the children. Uh, but outside the home, one of the most common associations with women or ways of viewing women was often through troubadours and love poetry and poems and performances. So this was highly influential, and it really displayed the power of women like almost nothing else in Europe did. This often recognized women. It praised women. The genre was very popular among women. Many of these women were patrons of troubadours. They would actually pay for. They would take women would get educated so they could be troubadours. Not like roaming around through common taverns, but they'd be troubadours at court. They'd be troubadours for the kings and the lords. They would be troubadours, and they would sing and perform for the upper classes, not to go perform in some common tavern somewhere where most of the other troubadours would perform. This image of a powerful woman was not merely a literary device. There's actually a lot of powerful women in Southern Europe. We actually see quite a few. We see Southern French queens owning land, or princesses. I guess they would be princesses usually, owning land, owning property. We even have images of women going into battle. What's the very famous one? Oh my gosh, I totally had her and it blanked on me there for a minute. The very famous young 14-year-old girl that went into battle for the French, and she was eventually burned at the stake. Anyway, you'd probably know who I'm talking about. It would come to me later. Anyway, the power of women, even in warfare, was celebrated through this poetry and this music. Very interesting. We still have some of these songs, some of these things you can still find. You can look up on the internet. You can still find some of the stuff, what we think it sounded like. Obviously, there's no recordings or anything, so we have to sort of try to reconstruct it, what we think the music sounded like. We have the words, but reading words. I mean, have you ever like taken like a popular song on the radio that's like fast and like it's the language is hard to understand? It's a rap song or something, or lots of different songs, and then actually looked at the lyrics, actually tried to read the lyrics. It's not the same. It isn't the same. It's totally different. So we have the words for many of the songs, many of the love poems, but we're not exactly sure how it sounded. But you can hear recreations of it on the internet, YouTube and stuff, where we think we know how it sounded. We think anyway. Love poetry spreads all across Europe. We see it go to Italy, France, England, Germany. We see similar poetry really become popular in those vernacular languages. So we'll see troubadours love poetry in German, well, in Italian, in English. So we'll see it in all these different languages. But you also should understand some of the poetry wasn't just about love. We see poetry about other things. Poetry about war, conquest, glory. So you can see poetry about battles, conquering enemies, killing enemies, the glory of battle. Yeah, this was really a real popular thing in this time period. It was something that brought a lot of people together because it allowed the upper classes and lower classes to actually share something. We find a lot of commonality because everyone feels love, everyone feels the effects of war, everyone feels anger, or they see relationships or sex. Really, the common concepts that you find in this troubadour's poetry really crossed socioeconomic lines. It really applied to all peoples, rich, poor, different countries. You could change the language, but love is still love, no matter what language it's in. War is still war, no matter what language it's in or what country it's from. This really crossed all the socioeconomic cultural lines in Europe. And as a result, it's incredibly popular. Incredibly popular, whether it was at the local taverns, local fairs, street corners, or performing for the highest kings and emperors. Really interesting. Here's an interesting example here. One of the remaining troubadour songs this time period. It's translated as the same of it is a chanteur mer de sceau. Yeah, there you go. That's French, I guess. It translates as I am obliged to sing of. I am obliged to sing of. It will be mine to sing of that which I would not desire. I am so aggrieved by the one of whom I am the friend. For I love him more than anything that can be. Pity does not help me toward him, nor courtliness, nor my beauty, nor my good name, nor my wit. And so I am cheated and betrayed as much as I deserved, as if I were ugly. That sounds like a modern song to me. That sounds like something you could hear on the radio, honestly. This kind of stuff about love and loss and anger at the scorned lover. Anyway, we have to can only imagine what it actually sounded like. Although, again, I'm sure you can find this on the internet. I bet you can. Probably find it on YouTube or something. A painting of a female troubadour. This was one of the very few professions that was accepted publicly for women. You must understand, women were really excluded from being in the public. Women were almost entirely forced to be in the private sphere, as we would call it. Home, farm, family, kids. Women were not supposed to be out among the masses of population. Troubadours were allowed to do this. Female troubadours are one of the few groups where it was accepted where women could be out in public. The only other large scale group of women in public would be prostitutes, probably, other than troubadour females. She played a medieval instrument called a vielle. A vielle. It's sort of like a fiddle. Sort of looks like that. Maybe that's the modern version of a violin. Maybe that's what it becomes a violin. I don't know. It's from inside a church in Spain. This at the time was Al-Andalus. This was actually Muslim Spain at the time. So you can see this is dated from the time of Muslim Spain. So this was actually put on the wall when Muslims controlled Spain. So you could see this was universal. English, French, German, Muslim, it's universal. This idea of these troubadours all across Europe. This was a common mode of communication across Europe, a way of transmitting culture and ideas between different peoples. Really interesting stuff. All right, next we'll transition into literature. Makes a lot of sense. So not as common as love poetry, but still very popular. Long narrative poems, basically stories. They glorified heroism on the battlefield. These were known as chansons de geste, songs of heroic deeds. Songs of heroic deeds. This is another form of vernacular language, literature, common literature. These poems followed a long old tradition, and like the story of troubadours, they also implied this code of behavior, this code of behavior for aristocrats, for the upper class. By the end of the 12th century, nobles and knights had begun to merge into one class. Nobles and knights had managed to beginning to merge into one single class of before there was the real elite, the real aristocrats, the true elite, and then there was the knights were sort of a middle class. By the 12th, 13th century, the upper class and the middle class start to merge into one upper class versus the rest of society, which was generally poor. They were threatened by the growing wealth of merchants, and of course the kings on the top. There was always the kings at the very top with the royal family. So you had this upper middle class of these upper class lords and elites, these upper class aristocrats. The knights They were now losing their military importance. The knights were not as much about going out and fighting wars anymore, even though they still talked like it and trained like it. It was more common to hire regular soldiers, regular people, commoners, to actually fight the battles. It was becoming more common in this time period. Mercenaries, um, regular farmers that were now soldiers, things like that. So they were worried. They wanted a code of conduct. They wanted something that set them apart, because now you had a lot of common people fighting, and the knights had traditionally trained to fight. They're doing very similar jobs now, militarily. So the knights start to want to elevate themselves above being a common warrior, and they start focusing on literature and art and culture, things I sort of already talked about, which certainly sets them aside, sets them apart, makes them unique. These epic poems often talked about this. These epic poems often sort of told these stories of how these knights could be special, how they were no longer just guys on a battlefield swinging a sword. They were actually more educated, more elite, more cultured than this, than just common people fighting on a battlefield, fighting for glory or honor. They examined themes and moral issues that made both war tragic, inevitable, and they even talked about contradictory ideas of war, about is war necessary? What's the causes of war? Why do we fight wars? This introspection was really, though, superficial. And why was that? Oh, hi over there. That was my puppy. This introspection was superficial, really. Because had they really thought about this, had they really spent time and energy, all this intellectual pursuits really talking about was war necessary, maybe they would have fought fewer wars. Maybe fewer people would have died. They didn't. Europe was under constant warfare. If the Europeans weren't fighting the Muslims, Europeans were killing and cutting each other's heads off. Europeans were always fighting somebody. So this is really superficial. This idea of this culture and this elitism and this new refined style of being a good moral character, it's bullshit, really. Because the reality is, they would act like that, and then they'd turn around the next day and go and wage war against someone else, killing thousands of people. It was really just to make themselves look better, but it really wasn't about truly changing anything. It was all false. It was really fake. But nonetheless, they do it. And there is an interesting influence of this. It really does create a whole new level, a whole new creation of this vernacular, this epic poetry, this romance poetry, and these stories and books, and all this literature. So there's certainly a literary advantage to it, but at the end of the day, it's really in the books and the stories. It doesn't really play out in real world. They want to make it look like it, they want to act like it, but the reality is they would prefer to go to war and win treasure and glory and money, rather than actually use some idea of peace and prosperity and compromise and loving one's neighbor. That's all bullshit. They didn't really do that. They wrote about it, they talked about it, they pretended to do it, but they didn't actually put it in practice. Um, I'm not saying they didn't go out and learn how to sing and write music. They did do stuff like that, but they didn't really then enforce any of it. They would then still go out and fight and kill each other and cause massive pain and misery and death and destruction all across Europe repeatedly. Whether it's Germany, whether it's France, whether it's England, whether it's Italy, it doesn't really matter. The longest poems were known as romance poetries. These were usually the longest ones. They're called romance because they usually specifically focused on a few main characters of men and women and their relationships. So usually there were two or three main characters, a male and female, and their relationships, and so they were romance. They were these romance poetries. The height of the popularity of these poems that gave this sort of this false sense of the highest ideal of society that most people didn't actually live up to was probably 12th, 13th century. So mid 1100s to mid 1200s is really the height of the popularity. Think King Arthur. King Arthur, for instance, was a story that came about in this time period. King Arthur, Lancelot. Lancelot was this honorable knight. He was the ideal chivalric knight who he was a great warrior. He was chivalrous. He followed the ideals of refinement, fair play, piety, meaning he believed in God, piety, a loyalty to his king. Of course, he screwed him all over by basically sleeping with the king's wife and destroyed everything. But you know, every story has to have a tragic ending, otherwise it's boring, right? I mean, if there wasn't something that happened, you read a story about happiness. I mean, you ever see a movie where they're all happy and loving in the beginning and then they just stay that way through the whole movie? No. There has to be tragedy. There has to be something tragic that happens. That's simply the way it is. Starts off nice. Then it usually goes to shit. And then somewhere at the end, the good guy wins. Maybe. A lot of knights simply didn't live up to this ideal. They simply didn't live up to this idea of chivalry and this idea of this refinement. Some of them tried. Some of them might learn to play music or write songs or poetry or learn how to paint. But at the end of the day, most simply didn't live up to it, didn't do it, or simply didn't care enough about doing it. All right, let's go to section 4, the Crusades. Well, a lot of things change regarding. We haven't honestly, even though religion has sort of been on the periphery of everything we've talked about, we really haven't talked much about religion, frankly, so far in this chapter. All right. So during the 12th century, we see a new religious fervor really start to embrace urban and rural life. A new religious excitement and interest seems to come about. And one of the real reasons behind this is there's multiple new versions of expression. Religious expression. We're going to talk about a couple of them in here. With this religious expression often comes a contradictory side. You might think religious expression would all be pro-religious, pro-God, pro-Catholic Church, which was the only real church of substance in Europe in the time period. Well, actually, a lot of it was. A lot of it certainly was. But some of it was not. Some of it actually criticized the church. Some of it actually challenged church authority. Some of it even criticized the church, saying it had too much money. It was too impersonal, uh, religiously superficial. Um, that the church didn't really care about people. It really cared more about its institution, its framework, money, land, taxes, building bigger, greater cathedrals. Um, I mean, some cathedrals were built that the cost of the cathedral itself was greater than the entire output of the entire county for an entire year. The point being, think about how much that money could have been used to help the poor, the needy, the homeless, women, children. Instead, they take pretty much all the money from the entire region and they pour it into this massive cathedral, which takes years, even decades to build. Isn't there other things that could have been done with that money to help people other than building this giant stone monstrosity? Catholic Church didn't think so at the time. So a lot of people were critical of the church. Critical of the church really was too focused in its head, and it wasn't really focused on people's hearts, or too focused on the purse rather than people's souls. And this isn't something that was across the board for all the church. Not every priest, of course not. But just in general, there's a real feeling that the church was out of touch with the actual real needs in Europe. And the needs weren't on building these massive churches, which didn't really serve anyone's needs. St. Francis, he lives from around 1182 to 1226. So around 1182 to 1226, 40 some years. He founded one of the most famous religious movements in the time period. The Franciscans is a Catholic religious movement, Catholic religious group known as the Franciscans. St. Francis was born into a family of wealthy cloth merchants. Again, he's known, you may have heard of him, St. Francis of Assisi. He was from the city of Assisi in Italy. He renounced his family's wealth. He gave up everything, and he walked away from it and lived a life of poverty and asceticism. Asceticism is where you give up all material needs. You don't, some ascetics, St. Francis didn't quite go this extreme. He wore clothes, but some ascetics wouldn't even wear clothes because that's a material need. You need clothes to stay warm or for modesty or whatever, to stay clean or avoid bugs or whatever. And some wouldn't even wear clothes. They were extreme ascetics. He wasn't that bad. But generally, he gave up everything of wealth, everything of status. He slept on the floor. He ate the most simple, basic foods. He lived an incredibly simplistic lifestyle, giving up all of the stuff of the church, giving up all the accoutrements of the church, all the wealth, all the power, all the status, all the gold and glitter and all the big fancy creations. He walked away from all that, believing that was not really the direction of God. God didn't want all that. God didn't need all that. God needed piety, devout faith. God didn't care whether you built a giant cathedral or whether you sat in the dirt and prayed to him. That made no difference to God. And that's what St. Francis believes, this idea that, he was not an open critic of the church, but he simply says this is really the way we should do it. This is really the more appropriate way of being with God and being in touch with God. This is the more appropriate way to serve the community, not by displays of wealth and power and money and all that. He had lots of followers. Um, Eventually, the Pope has to recognize him as an official order of the church because he simply is too devout, too pious. Too many people believe that he is actually speaking the words of God or truly represents God. Um, Eventually, the Pope recognizes what's known as the Brothers, the Franciscan Brotherhood, an official religious order of the Catholic Church. They typically lived in the cities, but they lived on the streets. They lived in poverty. They lived terrible conditions. They often didn't bathe, unless it was like convenient or something. They believed that they tried to be one with the common poor person. They performed manual labor. They preached in the streets. They lived on the streets. Some would have certainly been classified as homeless. They ministered to lepers, the people who were untouchable by the rest of society. They believed they were doing the real work of God. And they gained a lot of followers. And it really made a lot of people really question what was the Catholic Church really doing? Was it really, truly ministering to the needs of the population or not? An 18-year-old noble woman we call Claire, she forms her own order, another order, the Sisters of St. Francis. They worked alongside the friars for many years. The sisterhoods were technically not religious because women weren't allowed to be part of a religious group, even though you have nuns, right? But they weren't actually part of. It's hard to explain, and I'm not actually going to say I understand it completely. The nuns worked in religious institutions, like the nunneries and the convents, but they weren't actually clergy. They were like lay people, like you and me, who weren't actually of the church, but sort of working for the church and for the needs of the church. But they weren't actually considered priests or ministers, so they weren't technically clergy. Although most outsiders would have looked at them as sort of female clergy, they really weren't considered that by the church. So they did not have this religious authority. They couldn't do the different religious things that priests could do. They appeared to follow all the rules of the church, and really they did. And essentially, they followed all the rules of the male priests, but they were never technically ordained priests, or there was no such thing as a priestess, I guess. They were never ordained priests, but they did consider themselves to be they were very pious. They were followers of religious duties. They would take all the vows of celibacy, all the stuff, even though technically they were lay. They were regular people. They were not actually of the church. But they did all the same stuff the church did. The church, like these Franciscans did, they would they'd be celibate. They would weave cloth. They would tend to the sick and elderly. They would help all the disenfranchised groups in society that many people thought the church was simply overlooking. There's other types of stuff. Now, these are really orthodox. Orthodox meaning they generally follow the rules of the church. They believe pretty much wholeheartedly in Catholicism and Christianity. They preach from the Bible and the religious scripture. They don't really challenge the authority or power of God or religion, even if they are sort of subversively challenging the power of the Catholic Church and the way the Catholic Church uses its authority. But you do have the other side of it, the flip of it, the actual ones who actually challenge the church and believe openly challenge the church. These were often referred to as heretics. Any idea that contradicted church doctrine or church authority, and they were labeled as heretics or heresies. The most visible heretics were dualists. Dualists actually saw the world as torn between good and evil and believed that the actual world we live in today is actually hell. Basically, this is hell. The world we live here on earth is hell. There's not a hell you go to if you die. You have really, if you die, you simply cease to exist. But if you can be elevated and actually saved, then you can go to heaven after death. But all the evil that really exists is our world that we live in. This is hell that we live in. Now, the dualists do some things like the Orthodox. They reject sex. They reject wealth. Some of the, like St. Francis here, some of these ascetics. However, they also reject the church. So they live very simple, austere, plain lives, celibate lives, but they also reject the church authority because the church authority is where? Do you get it now? Why the church had such a problem with this? It isn't that this is hell on earth. That was a problem for the church, certainly. But the bigger problem is everything here on the material world is hell. What is on the material world? The church. So you see, the Catholic Church is actually hell. That's the dualists. Everything here on earth is hell. That means the Catholic Church is part of hell. The Catholic Church would not have been okay with this idea that they're actually in hell, that they're actually part of hell, which is what the dualists say. So they had to reject church too. They had to reject any type of church or religious authority because that's hell as well. The only true authority is God and the scripture of God, the actual words of God. So the only authority that matters would be the actual words of God, not the church, because the church is actually part of hell. Interesting way of looking at it. These would have definitely been enemies of the church, these heretics. The church condemned them. They also condemned any lay people because many heretics also allowed lay people to preach, meaning a non-ordained person by the church. Well, of course, if you're a heretic, the church probably isn't ordaining you. So you're non-ordained, so you are not officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church, and yet they're preaching like ministers. Some of you might already be thinking, well, this is, some of you that are more knowledgeable about this subject might be thinking Protestantism, right? That's still two more centuries in the future, still a couple hundred years. But some of the ideas of Protestantism is an outgrowth of some of this. Protestantism is a break with the Catholic Church in the 1500s. But what you can tell is here, even as back as the 1100s, we already have people challenging the authority of the church, saying the church really is not concerned with the needs of most common people, truly. And that is really what causes the break, the Protestant Reformation, which we are not going to be getting into. Very interesting. This is the Beguine Psalm. The Beguines, if I wasn't perfectly clear, that was just one of those groups, one of those orders of the female orders. The Beguines are one of those female orders. Pretty much when I was describing all that stuff, you could apply it to the order of the Sisters of St. Francis or the Beguines. It's pretty much interchangeable. I'm not saying they're the same, they're not, but they're close enough for our purposes. All those things I talked about, women and religion, really could apply to both, generally speaking. It's the Psalm book. The technically of the church. Remember, they're not technically of the church. They're not ordained. They acted like it, though. They acted like they were actually priests of the church, even though they weren't officially of the church. This is created by them. It focuses also on Mary. You have Mary and baby Jesus up here. Mary, who has a crown on her head. Interesting. Jesus here with the halo over his head. Jesus, we also have her at the bottom. She's also at the bottom of this image too. You have her down here. You have holding baby Jesus in her hands. She reigns as the Queen of Heaven. You could easily see why the church might have a problem with this. Um, why would the church have a problem with this? There's a discussion question, maybe. One of the discussion questions. Where's God in this image? Hint, hint, God is not in this image. Nope. Focus on this image is on the women of the church. There's some men. There are some men. A couple of saints. The focus is on the women and Jesus, baby Jesus. It's a focus on women. The church would have a problem with this. This would have been, to some people in the church, a heresy. Even though they believed they were doing the work of God, helping people, doing the work of God that in many ways the church wasn't doing. How could this have been a real issue with people of the church? Think about religion authority. Think about women. Think about the lack of focus on God. Think about the fact that they are writing scriptures. This is a psalm book. It's religious scripture. They're writing religious scriptures. They're writing religious writings, even though they're not actually part of the church. They're not ordained. They haven't been officially trained by the church at a seminary school. They're women in this time and period in Europe where women have limited authority. And then combine that with the other heretic groups, all around the same time period. There were multiple heresies, different types of heresies. Then add into that the fact that they're also dealing with another major religious question of Islam, because they're also fighting against Islam in the same time period, literally going to wars. And the Catholic Church was at the center of the Crusades against Islam, against the Muslims. All this is happening at the same time. All of these are challenges to religious authority of the Catholic Church. Significant, really is. Think about King Henry up there, what he was doing. He was now saying the laws and the church are separate. The church can't even determine laws, or the church can't even try court cases. That priests that break the law in England now have to be tried in English court. They don't get to be tried by the church. The church doesn't get to decide it. The secular courts of the king actually get to decide. So you put all these things together, and there's a lot of issue, a lot of controversy, a lot of challenges to the authority of the church in Europe in this time period, coming from every direction, literally. And think how women play into this. There's one group. Well, let's talk about the Crusades. All right. The First Crusade was successful. They conquered Jerusalem. They took Jerusalem back. They held on to it for the better part of a century, something like that. Maybe even more than a century. Well, the Second Crusade was a big failure. It was a disaster. There were altogether about 8 crusades, official, even though there was more than that, but there was officially 8. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 92, it aimed at taking control of Jerusalem from the Muslims, again, which had been retaken by the Muslims. The Muslims had retaken Jerusalem. Now they were trying to take it back. Again, they never took it back a second time. They only had it the once. And they got it the First Crusade. The Muslims eventually take it back, and then they spend years trying to take it back again. They're never successful. The Muslim leader Saladin actually is controlling Jerusalem at the time. He ruled over Palestine, which was Jerusalem at the time. He ruled over Egypt and Syria. He actually retook Jerusalem in 1187. So that meant the Christians had held on Jerusalem for about a century, for about 100 years or so. Now, this Third Crusade is called by the Pope and led by Emperor Barbarossa. We've talked about Barbarossa. And Philip II of France. And Leopold of Austria. And Richard I of England. 4 European kings all got together. That would be probably wrong to say all got together. Each one pretty much had their own separate armies. And in truth, they were all going to the Holy Lands to compete with each other. This was really competition to see who could actually conquer the Holy Lands first and get the most glory and credit. So even though they were technically all Christian kings, all called by the church, all going to fight for Christian glory and retake the Holy Lands, they were just as much competing with each other. One of the reasons for failure is probably the fact that they really weren't in a partnership, they were in a competition to see who could get there first. It was almost like a race. So you have Leopold of Austria, Philip II of France, Barbarossa of Germany, and King Richard of England. All people we've talked about, except for we don't really talk about Austria. This Third Crusade was hampered by all the political tensions between the different emperors and the different kings. It really accomplished very little, and it was a crushing defeat. They were fractured. They went as four separate armies instead of one army. No one could agree to who would be in charge. No one could agree that one person, and why? Why is that? Of course. If one person's in charge of the army and the army wins, who gets all the credit? That one king gets all the credit. No one was willing to do that. No one was willing to set aside their own personal glory and needs, their own personal conquest for vengeance and power for the greater good of Europe and the Christian faith or whatever. None of them were willing to do it. So it was a big failure. Barbarossa died on the way. He actually drowned. King Richard was captured. I mean, it was disaster. It was disaster. Then you get the Fourth Crusade, which comes along next. I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm just going to cover a couple of high points here. Fourth Crusade was full of prejudice and religious zeal. Many of the Crusaders actually changed their plans, and instead of marching through Constantinople, which is the Byzantine Empire, which is still around, and going to the Holy Lands, they stop in Constantinople and they actually take over the city and conquer Constantinople. And for a few years, actually, it's really short. It's only like a year or two. They actually conquer Byzantium, all in the name of the Roman Catholic Christian God or what. The Christian faith in Byzantium and the Christian faith in Europe had been at odds forever. We've talked about that. So it was a separate Christian faith. It was what we refer to as Eastern Orthodox. So it was already a separate religious Christian faith, which had split due to the Great Schism. So they were going to the Holy Lands to conquer, kill Muslims, conquer the Holy Lands, take back Jerusalem, and they simply stopped in Constantinople and took over Byzantium. Another Christian kingdom, really. You could see what these people were for. These crusades were called by the church, but then the actual people who fought the crusades were secular soldiers and men and mercenaries and kings who really cared about nothing but glory, power, and honor, and wealth, status. That's really all that mattered. Well, why do this to other ones? Well, this particular one had some money involved. The Venetians from Venice, Italy, actually transported the Crusaders over across the Mediterranean. When they got there, the Crusaders didn't have money to pay the Venetians. I don't know if they took them on credit. What the hell? I don't really know. And so the Venetians expected payment. They didn't have it. So with the Venetians not having payment, they actually persuaded the Crusaders, you know what you can pay us back? Go take over Constantinople. Go conquer Constantinople. So you got all these Christian crusaders that were marching to the Holy Lands to defeat Muslims and take back Jerusalem and all in the name of God. And Venetians pretty much bribe them and say, you know what? Instead of paying us, why don't you just take over Constantinople? Great. Go ahead and do that. We're good with that. And the Crusaders totally gave up on the whole idea of the Holy Lands and just went and took over Constantinople. Why'd they do that? Constantinople was a big merchant. A lot of their wealth was coming from merchants and trade and trade with the East. Well, the other big merchant groups, the other big trade groups in Europe was Italy. So what Italy did, the Venetian lords, what they did in Venice is they bribed European kings and lords to conquer their trade enemy, Constantinople, to basically knock them out of the way so the Venetians could have unobstructed trade rights to the east. It's all about money. Everybody agreed to it. Everybody was like, it's all about money. And Constantinople gets conquered temporarily to open up the floodgates for Venice to increase its trade routes and income and money. Really crazy. It was a economic commercial rival that they were able to take out of the picture for a couple years by bribing the Crusaders. All right, they sack, they rape, they kill, they plunder, they burn part of the city, they take relics and treasure. The greatest defeat Constantinople ever received, other than when it is finally conquered in 1453 by the Muslims, is this invasion by other Christian crusaders who arrived in Constantinople as friends and compatriots and then betrayed them and conquered and burned part of the city. The greatest defeat they ever received until their empire ended was by people who were supposedly their friends. What's that old saying go? I don't even know where it comes from. Keep your enemies close and your friends closer, or keep your friends close and your enemies close and your friends closer. Anyway, it's to the point of watch over your enemies, but the ones you really have to be careful of are your friends. Why? Because those are the ones you trust into your home, which makes it much easier for them to backstab you. Let's see what else. Eventually, when they leave, Byzantium is sort of a semi-dependent empire on Italy. They're still technically an empire, an independent kingdom, but they're partly dependent on Italy as a result of this. Well, this continues. The Fourth Crusade, the Fifth Crusade, the Sixth Crusade, the Seventh Crusade, the Eighth Crusade. I'm running out of fingers. I believe there were 8 official crusades, even though some historians can actually tack up the number as high as 14. I mean, the Crusades went on for 200 years, and many of the Crusades only lasted a couple years. So if you throw in some of the partial Crusades, the Peasants' Crusade, different little crusades where just some king took it upon himself to march an army to the Holy Lands and was utterly defeated. There might have been as many as 14, although there were 8 official. Let's see what else. The largest mass mobilization of armies was the Fourth Crusade. The rest of them are much smaller, much more independent. Some of them led by just single kingdoms instead of like the Fourth Crusade was 4 kingdoms, the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, and they got their ass kicked. New values placed greater emphasis on interior pilgrimages after this, really more focused on interior pilgrimages to religious sites, because that was an important part of the Crusades as well. To retake the Holy Lands so the Christians could take pilgrimages to Jerusalem, the place of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the homeland of Jesus. So that was a big focus. So the Christians could actually go and find the actual homelands of the Christian faith. The thing is, they could already. That's a real interesting hypocrisy of this. Muslims had open door policy for Christians before the Crusades. Christians were welcome in the Muslim lands. Muslims had no problem with Christians. There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians and Jews that lived in Muslim territories and Muslim conquer. I mean, yeah, so the Muslims controlled Spain, all of northern Africa, all of the Middle East, parts of Asia, all the Arabian Peninsula, almost to China. Collectively, even though they were all separate empires and kingdoms by this point in time, if you actually took all the Muslim territories together, it was a greater empire than ever existed or ever will exist in the history of the world. Maybe the Mongols. The Mongols might be separate from that, but that's it. They weren't united, though. Point being, they had millions and millions of people who were non-Muslims living under them peacefully. Anyone could take a crusade to the Holy Land and go to Jerusalem before the Crusades peacefully. It was not a problem. You had to usually pay a tax or a fee. That was it. You could do it. The majority of people that lived in much of the Middle East weren't Muslim. Muslims were fine with that. They liked non-Muslims living under them because they got to tax them. The rules allowed them to tax them. So they were a major source of revenue were non-Muslims living in Muslim lands. So the weird hypocrisy of this is the idea of retaking the Holy Lands for pilgrimages was a total farce. That was a joke. That was not even real. The whole Crusades began, I guess I even talked about that. The whole Crusades began for one purpose. The Byzantines actually called the Pope in Rome to help him defeat the Muslims. This was never about retaking the Holy Lands. That's not how it all began. Now, the Catholic Church made it about that. The Catholic Church made the Crusades about their glory and power. The Crusades ultimately are really about the glorification of the Catholic Church in this time period. Really, it was all about power and glory for the church. That's what it was about. Now, that's not unusual. That's not like it's unique or the church was particularly evil or bad or anything. Everybody was concerned with that. Whether it was the church, Eastern Orthodox Church, Byzantium, whether it was the different kings in Europe, whether it was the different kings in Muslim lands, the different caliphs, the different sultans. Really, all anyone cared about was power and glory and authority. What just is significant is the church wasn't different. You might think the church should have been held to a higher standard. It should have been held to a higher standard. The thing is, it didn't live up to that. The church had the same desire for glory, power, and status as every other king and emperor did, and every other lord. They were simply no different. They weren't special. It was all about power and status. It always was. The Crusades moved to this new function, this new idea. They were no longer about retaking Jerusalem. Now they were simply about the power and glory of the church and of European kings. The church and the kings really create this idea of this fanaticism to go and retake the Holy Lands from Christians' enemies, which is the Muslims. But the thing is, everybody was attacked by this because eventually it simply became about glory and status and power. Oh, not eventually, it really was from the beginning. From the very first crusade, it was about that. Who were the enemies? Everyone. They attacked and conquered. They killed and took over kingdoms in Spain. Only half of Spain was Muslim. The other half of Spain was now Christian kingdoms. They conquered those. They conquered Russian lands and Russian territories. They conquered and burned Jewish cities. They conquered other Christian kingdoms. Byzantium. This was simply about power and status. This was not about anything holy or religious or any type of religious meaning. This wasn't anything sacred. This was entirely about secular power and dominance, all in the name of God. They all claimed that they were doing the work of God, and truthfully, these people who were often claiming they were doing the work of God were really heretics themselves. I can't, in my understanding of God, I can't believe God would have wanted all of this misery and suffering and death and destruction. It just doesn't make sense to me. That's not my understanding of what God stands for. So they were all heretics, really, whether it was kings or the church or whoever. None of them, I think, really were representing, other than maybe the sisters of St. Francis and people like St. Francis. There were other orders. That wasn't the only ones. Oh, well, it's really interesting, really, how it goes here. And this gives you an idea of some of the different wars, some of the different crusades. Albigensian Crusade, the Northern Crusades, the Christian attacks in Spain, Fourth Crusade, Third Crusade. In case you see the map here, several of these crusades don't actually go to the Holy Lands. Several of these crusades go to places that are not Holy Lands or even Muslim controlled. Yeah. All right. Victorious crusades in Europe. In addition to the crusades, there were lots of other crusades across Europe, sort of as I talked about. Wars in Spain, Aragon, Castile, Portugal. That's all Spain. We see the division of Spain into three territories: Aragon in the east, Castile in the middle, Portugal in the southwest. Eventually, Portugal becomes its own separate country. These leaders often competed against each other. They often were competing against each other and Muslims, because half of Spain was still under the Muslim Al-Andalus, and the northern Africa was under the authority of the Berbers. So you have Andalusian Muslims in Spain, the Berber Muslims in northern Africa. Um, uh, Eventually, the Muslims are kicked out of Spain. Eventually, it happens in not until 1400s completely, but it does start to work here. We see kings of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon sending victorious armies against the Muslims in Spain. Then around 1212, we see crusades going against Muslims in Spain and northern Africa. They actually give a name to this. I don't have it here on the slide. It's known as the Reconquista. That's Spanish. The Reconquista, meaning reconquest, meaning the retaking of Spain. Because Spain had been, to say it was Christian would be wrong, because when the Muslims take over Spain, it's not really Christian exactly. It's mostly still pagan, I suppose. However, it had been part of the Christian Roman Empire, so maybe technically it was Christian, but most people in Spain weren't Christian. It was technically Christian because it had been part of the Christian Roman Empire, but most people in Spain were probably still pagans. Nonetheless, they want to reconquer Spain to bring it back into the Christian fold, bring it back into the Christian domain, and of course, more than anything, defeat the Muslims. It doesn't completely end until 1492, same year as Columbus, is when the last region of Spain is finally conquered. Just happens to be the same year. But it was going on all the way from the 1100s. So slowly they were chipping away and taking back parts of Spain over a 300-year period, until finally they conquer the last bit of Spain, and push the last Muslims back into northern Africa in 1492. See what else we want to talk about there. Then we go to the east. Now we look at the Baltic region. Oh, there it is. There it is. See, I was there. I just had to get to it. Then we look in the Baltic region. We see Slavic-speaking peoples in Eastern Europe being targeted by the Crusades. They were Christian, but they were a different type of Christian. They were Eastern Orthodox Christian. They were there's other religious sects. I can't think of the names of them, but there's a couple other religious groups. They were often targeted by the Crusaders. Oh, it should also be noted in Eastern Europe there was a lot of Jews. Entire Jewish cities were burnt down. Thousands of Jews were killed and murdered by Christian Crusaders. For what reason? It's not clear. Simply because they were heretics, and technically they would fall under the heretics because they don't believe in Catholic Christian Orthodox belief, so technically they were heretics. Maybe simply for that. Maybe simply because so many millions of Jews live peacefully under Muslim rule. They lived near the enemy, so they must be the enemy. Or maybe it's just a long history of Muslim of Jewish prejudice and Jewish hatred and Jewish discrimination, which has really existed for thousands of years. The idea of Jewish persecution, it's not a made up thing, it's a real thing. Jews have been persecuted all through history. This is simply another episode in that, which resulted in the deaths of many. What about Northern Crusades in Denmark? We see Northern Crusades where the Denmarks attacked the Slavs. They attacked the Eastern European regions. The Slavs, usually Slavic peoples, referring to sort of that region between Germany and sort of that little region between Germany and Russia. What we think of as Eastern Europe is often referred to as the Slavic region. The princes in Slavic regions typically surrendered and converted, and eventually most of them become part of the Holy Roman Empire, actually. They often suffered. They often found advantageous, though. Many of them were pagans, and they found advantageous to simply convert to Christianity. For no other reason, they didn't get attacked. Convert to Christianity, you don't get attacked. You don't get molested by the Christian soldiers constantly. And maybe now that you're part of the Christian empires, you get to enjoy more status and wealth as Christian kings. We do see German speakers in the Baltic region. We do see an enduring relationship between Germany and Eastern Europe, which exists all the way to modern times. This association between Germany and Eastern Europe, because Germany is really Central Europe. Baltic peoples around the Baltic Sea, they're often surrounded by churches and monasteries, so we start seeing a lot of influence. What is really important about all this? We see, in essence, the influence of Europe transferred to Eastern Europe. That's really what you're looking at. The influence of Christian and teaching, theology, university, schools, education, the entire systems of Europe that we've been talking about with Germany and France for chapters now, really is transplanted in Eastern Europe and Russia. This is when Russia really becomes part of Europe. Even though most of Russia is in Asia, we consider Russia European. Why? The reason is right here. Russia culturally, economically, socially, really becomes European in the way it runs, and the way it governs. It deals with the poor. Religiously, even though it does become a separate religion, Eastern Orthodox, it's still Christian, which most of Asia is not. So in almost every way, Russia is much more European than Asian. Think Chinese, India. So the Russians, am I going to a Russian accent there? I'm not sure. Was that Russian accent? Maybe. The Ruskies are more European than Asian, even though most of Russia is in Asia. So anyway, this is the time when they start. They start to build castles and they start to have monasteries, and they really start to look like Europe instead of Asia. And from henceforth, pretty much Russia is considered European, even though the country is almost entirely actually in Asia. Let's see. We see more crusades going on here. The Abyssinian Crusade I mentioned. I'm not going to worry about that right there. Let's see what else I want to mention. If there's anything else on here. We see invasions into France. We actually see parts of France being conquered. We actually see parts of France being actually conquered as heretics. Parts of France. This is the Albigensian Did I say it right? Albigensian Crusade. 1209 to 1229. This really marks the first time that a pope actually grants warriors in Europe the same authority as going to the Holy Land. What does that mean? The pope in the church grants the same authority to Christian crusaders attacking other Christian nations in Europe, but not Catholic, the same authority and the same power and rights as if they were attacking Muslims. What does that mean? Well, we sort of talked about it. What could the Christians do to the Muslims and those who stood in their way in the Crusades? Literally anything. The Pope promised salvation for anyone who was on a crusade doing the work of God, which means you could murder, you could rape, you could pillage, you could burn cities, you could kill thousands of innocents, you could steal, you could bribe, you literally could do anything. As long as you were doing the work of God, pushing the actual crusade and pushing the agenda of the church, you'd be forgiven for all your sins. That's exactly how it's worded. You can look it up. You actually see translations of missives, what they were called, which are messages. That might be the origin of the word message. I'm not sure. But these missives would actually be sent out. And they said, if you read translated versions, they say very clearly, you'll be forgiven of all sins. All sins against God will be forgiven if you are on the crusade and you are working for the church and you're doing the work of God in the church. All sins forgiven. People took this literally. Many of these soldiers, many of these crusaders took it literally. They did anything they wanted. Because at the end of the day, all that mattered was, are you going to heaven? Is your soul saved? And the church would, of course, tell them it was. And I don't know the bigger travesty of justice here. Obviously, the travesty of justice where so many innocents were hurt. Or the bigger travesty of justice, the fact that the church was lying to them. Obviously, their soul wouldn't be saved if they're committing all these heinous acts and criminal acts and acts against God purposefully and simply expecting the church to forgive them. Their souls are condemned. But yet the church is telling them they're saved, but they're really not, of course. So there's, what's the bigger sin? I don't know, both maybe. It's all bad. The Crusades are all bad, really. Really, they're all bad. It has everlasting influence on European society. We could say you could find ways to still influence European society today. What the Crusades did. Anyway, so yeah, the Sabbathessian Crusade does this. The Crusade had political, religious dimensions. It really it pits French people against French people. You have French people killing French people who before were brothers and friends and had traded before. Now they're killing each other in the streets, all in the name of different religious faiths, all in the name of different. They're all Christian, just different versions of Christianity because they conflict with the established Catholic Orthodox Christianity. They wanted to impress the church, win new lands and power. In 1229, after over 20 years of fighting the Capetian kings of France, we actually mentioned Hugh Capet and the Capetians before. The Capetian kings of France take over the Crusades. They bring over the entire country of France under their control. So what is the result of this ultimately? Millions dead. There's some. No one has an accurate record. It's really hard to look at accurate records. France did a really good job of keeping records, so we think it's close. We think it's close. The number is millions. This 20-year crusade cost the lives of maybe 2 million people. All in the name of our church is better than your church. Ultimately, it brings all of France under the control of the Capetian kings and creates what might be the most powerful country in Europe in the next couple centuries. France, with the church right beside it the whole time. It really does consolidate power, and it really does give France and the Catholic Church an iron grip on much of Europe, but at the cost of what? Millions of innocent lives? Anyway. Let's see what we got going on here. This is the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. That's Spain. It's a peninsula. It's technically known as, I guess geographically, the Iberian Peninsula, or it's known as Iberia. Here we have the different regions. Those are the things we talk about: Portugal, Castile, Aragon. This is still Al-Andalus down here. This is around the 1200s, so this is still Muslim down here at the bottom. And of course, Northern Africa is held by the Muslim Berbers. or the Almoravid Empire. It's kind of, I don't have the exact time periods, but the Almoravids are in here around the same time period. Um, just gives you an idea what we're talking about. You can sort of put a map to some of it. Here's France. You see wars going on between these different kings, all vying for control in northern France. They would be just as likely to attack each other as attack Muslims because they wanted power, whether it was from Muslims or other Christians. Anyone who challenged their authority, they would go after. And this is the Reconquista. Castile is reconquered by Aragon over here. All this happens in about a 62-year period. Most of this is reconquered in 62 years. It takes them another 2 centuries to retake all this because they don't have anywhere to go. One of the reasons the Andalusians were able to hang on for 200 more years is Northern Africa was a different empire, a different kingdom. Much of it controlled by the Berbers. So they weren't necessarily friends. Even though they're all the same faith, again, look at Christians killing Christians in Europe. Just because they're the same faith doesn't mean they like each other or get along. So we have Muslims going to war with Muslim kingdoms, same as we see Christian kings going to war with Christian kings. It's no different. So the Andalusians had nowhere to go. They couldn't go down here to Northern Africa because that was another kingdom. So they literally had to fight for their lives in Spain to hold on to what they had because there was nothing else. There was no place to retreat. So it took 200 more years to actually conquer them completely, and lots of bloodshed. I've never actually seen numbers on how many people died on the wars during the Reconquista, but I considering how many battles and wars there were dozens of wars, hundreds of battles over almost a 400-year period. Had to have cost the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. It had to have really been. You got to consider, folks, understand, I have said it before, the people that die as a result of a war, often just as many, if not more, die that never wear a uniform or pick up a weapon. Oftentimes, the death toll from war is actually greater for the non-combatants, people who die of starvation, malnutrition, disease, because battles are fought on the fields, the farmlands. They destroy and burn down cities. They burn all the crops. They kill all the animals. Oftentimes, long after the battle is over, people are dying as a result of the war. More people often die after the war, but it's still as a result of the battle. So if 50,000 soldiers die, 100,000 people might die after the battle's over, all as a result of it. So the death toll is much greater than you might think just looking at the battle death. It's usually much greater if you look at the after effects of it. And who is it that's doing all the suffering? It's not the soldiers who signed up to fight, although don't get me wrong, some of them didn't sign up, some were forced to fight. But it's not the soldiers with swords and shields. It's the civilians, the men, the women, the children, who never pick up a weapon, that often suffer. War is a terrible thing. I'm not saying war isn't necessary. Sometimes war is necessary. World War I, World War II, sometimes it's necessary. But I would argue most wars are not necessary. And the death toll from it's just so much misery and suffering that's just unnecessary. This is Almoral Castle, probably named for the kingdom that ruled there for in this part of the world for a while, the Almoravids. The Almoral Castle. This is in Spain. It was given to the Templars when they joined the Reconquista. I didn't really talk about the Templars, I don't think. Not in this class. My world history class, I think I talked about the Templars. They were a religious sect as well that was sort of created when they invaded the Holy Lands. And they were all about treasure and wealth and status, really. This was given to the Templars when they joined the Reconquista to help remove Muslims from Spain. These crusaders now had lots of enemies and goals that had nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with conquering Holy Lands. We find that only about half the Crusades really focused on the Holy Lands, and about half the others focused on all the other heretics, not in the Holy Lands. And many times those heretics were fellow Christians, just not the right kind of Christians. Map of the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, which ultimately unites almost all of France under the authority of one king. First time really since, I don't know, the Carolingians ruled France. Go back 200 years. So maybe the first time France was really under one authority in over 2 centuries, at the end of the Albigensian. So even though this was portrayed as a religious crusade against heretics, the result was actually to unify all of France under one king. Makes you really question what the crusade was actually about. I mean, really. Nonetheless, it's the way it works. All right, that's it. That's it. We've had enough of this. A lot of this is sad and depressing, so we're done with the chapter. Thanks, everybody.